After his return to Czechoslovakia from the USSR in 1935, Jiří Weil's journalistic and literary activity exploded. Besides publications in a broad range of magazines, two books stand out. They were named many times here already, both from 1937. The first was not named. Czechs at Work in the Land of Five-Year Plans, Češi pracují v zemi pětiletek, was released in February 1937, and the second, From Moscow to Border, appeared in late autumn of the same year. A third book, The Wooden Spoon, was in the making. However, it appeared only decades later. All these works converge in many ways, but their style differs too. The book about Czechs in the USSR was meant to be a documentary of sorts, a reportage, while From Moscow to Border and The Wooden Spoon are literary narratives that qualify as novels, although strong biographical features repeatedly reveal them as near documentary. Turning to Czechs at Work first, Češi pracují v zemi pětiletek. We find here portraits of Czech workers and craftsmen who happened to live in the USSR in the interwar time and participated in the build-up of this country. Initial chapters focus on Moscow, especially on the presence of Czech workers in the construction of the metro, while the subsequent chapters shift the perspective to Central Asia, where a Czech industrial cooperative, the Interhelpo, was active. Chapters situated on, The reasons why Czech workers lived in the USSR differed. Some were prisoners of war who happened to stay in this country after the World War I, while some came during the 1920s, mostly, although not exclusively, with an ideological agenda on the back of their minds. Whatever the reasons, they clearly were foreigners, as Russia or the USSR was not their native country. Were they displaced? Were they in a diaspora? What did their native land mean to them? Where did they belong? By and large, the feeling of displacement is not prominent in Czechs at Work in the Land of Five-Year Plans. Weil highlights Czechs who accepted the challenge and demonstrated their class consciousness. A chapter on a certain Ladislav Kupa, a worker originally from the Czech industrial town of Kladno, is instructive in this respect. It begins with a moving paragraph about Bohemia, very moving. There is the land of Bohemia. It has villages and towns. It has valleys and mountains. It has plains and meadows. Rivers cut their way through rocks. River banks are firm. Villages lie at streams or by streams. At crossroads, there are crosses with Jesus Christ hanging on them, and the inscription reads, "Pause here, and I will comfort you." However, the next paragraph negates all nostalgia resolutely. Neither Kupa nor his rebellious father were sentimental about this idyll. They did not want to be consoled. They were social underdogs. Attracted by the Bolshevik Revolution, they moved to the USSR, which promised a fundamental change. Importantly, there is no talk about return or returning. Another chapter revolves around a certain Mr. Hubáček from Vsetín. He was in Russia by the end of the war, but did not return home either. His path led him to Kyrgyzstan, where he worked with Kyrgyz people, teaching them all sorts of skills, and eventually joining them in another war, a war on the poor against the rich, that is, the revolution. At the end, he helped found the commune New Time on the banks of the lake Issyk-Kul, and, quote, he never returned to Valašsko. Unsurprisingly, Kyrgyzstan and later also Kazakhstan play a major role in Weil's narrative of this time. After he was terminated at his Moscow job, he was exiled to these regions by the Communist Party. And my understanding is that it was the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, actually. So he could redeem himself from lackluster performance. Specifically, the location was the cooperative Interhelpo. This was a solidarity project established near Bishkek or Frunze by Czech, Slovaks, and other nationalities from Czechoslovakia who came to Kyrgyzstan, eventually forming a group of more than 1,300 persons. They were mostly communists and initially fans of Ido, a variant of Esperanto, hence the term Interhelpo. By the time Weil arrived, Interhelpo was 10 years old. It had a history of ups and downs, yet it proved itself under extreme conditions, although the administrative pressure of Stalin's bureaucracy eventually destroyed its status as a cooperative. In fact, several of its founders did not return from Gulag. One of the details Weil could not, or perhaps did not want to, write about. As long as he was in Interhelpo, he supplied Prague with outright propaganda reports in the style of Julius Fučík, basically. All right. Was Interhelpo a home, a new home? In The Wooden Spoon, Weil created a woman character, Lida Raisova, who was born in the old country but grew up in Interhelpo and fully participated in its construction and rise. But at the end of the book, she is mobilized, as it is called, by the Komsomol for an assignment to a mammoth metallurgy project in Kazakhstan, the so-called Balkhastroy. Indeed, this was a trying moment for her. Quote, 3 more weeks for her. Few of them are left to say goodbye. And yet it is necessary to at least say goodbye to Interhelpo's farm number 1, which is far from the settlement. There is a large orchard there that Lida planted when she was still small. The trees grow there next to the main irrigation channel. Water flows there vigorously like her native village, which Lida remembers from her childhood. They lived in a house by a stream. Lida heard the sound of water flowing during day and night, or day and night. Obviously, this is a passage that expresses Lida's belonging to a place she helped build, but also a passage that is Interhelpo, but also a passage in which a distant home is lurking, a place of streaming water, a place of life. However, not unlike Ladislav Kupa, Lida proves to be loyal to progress and follows the Komsomol order to Balkhastroy, where she, despite hardship, decides to stay beyond the term of her original assignment. In the final scene of the novel, she talks to another Czech, mentioned many times here already, Jan Fischer, literary alter ego of Weil's, who works at Balkhastroy as a kind of worker journalist. Fischer understands Lida's goodbye to Interhelpo and her decision to stay. She became a Soviet woman and would eventually be convinced to stay. For her, the new construction site, Balkhastroy, could only invoke a song of future victories. But unlike her, Weil, alias Fischer, makes the local musical instrument, the dutar, sing a different song. Sing, dutars, also above the native land, a landmark in the middle of Europe. The waters bubble on her meadows. The woods rustle on her border mountains. She's far away. The green crow of Kyrgyzstan or Kyrgyzstan will never make it to fly there. The varan lizard will not manage to crawl there. The black-tailed gazelle will not jump there. It is my country to which I am returning. The sentence, it is my country to which I am returning, is placed strategically at the very end of this extensive saga, but Fischer had indicated his companions already before that he did not like Balkhastroy. We could leave it at these passages and stop guessing whether Jan Fischer's voice is that of Weil's or not, but Weil, in fact, reported on his return from the USSR in the first person in an essay he published in April 1937, back in Prague. The essay is more explicit than we read these passages in The Wooden Spoon. He describes his return home via a stopover in Moscow, which he finds bustling and attractive. But after laying out the charms of the metropolis, he adds the following lengthy passage. Back in Moscow. But I had to think of my country. She was emerging from Moscow's murky fog, as well as from Asia's dusty air. The sun shone above her. She rose from the gentle hills to the ridges of the giant mountains, the homeland. I knew now that I had been thinking of her all the time I was in Russia, but her voice was lost in the muddy rain of Moscow and the Asian sands of Karakum. Now that I was returning to her, her voice thundered with every step on the slippery asphalt of Moscow sidewalks. I heard the voice of the Vltava River at the banks of the Moscow River. I saw Vltava near Život. I will need some help with this. I saw Vltava near Život in the dark shadows, when water splashed silently by the banks. I saw Vltava's banks, the firm banks of the mountains through which she makes its way, Vltava makes its way. And I forgot the banks of Asiatic rivers, where the clay crumbles and slides down, the river changes its course, and it's lost in the endless desert. A bit later, he returns to the theme of his native land, defending it as one that gave him life and let him rejoice or mourn, as the case might be. He's now looking forward to this land. Even vrby u potoka are part of it. In sum, both in his fiction Weil and journalism, Weil negotiates not only Soviet values, but also the concept of the native land, and whereby his account of the latter, the native land, uses a high-style language of belonging, where belonging we can understand as the sense of comfort, acceptance, and certitude in a particular place or group of people. I think I will probably have to jump a little bit ahead. The first book, let's turn to the post-war time. The first book that Weil published after World War II was a collection of short stories entitled Colors, 1946. Little known, it contains texts he wrote in the years 1943-45, in part when he was in hiding to avoid deportation. In our context, Black and White, a story dated 1945, stands out as it describes a death march of camp prisoners who are marched from the Bavarian city of Hof eastward to a place in Bohemia, which Weil calls Sterbestadt, which is Theresienstadt. There is not much explanation regarding the background and the sense of this process. The focus being on the impoverished prisoners, their brutal German guards, and the direction of the march, Bohemia. They are returning. However, the prisoners' return is not a happy one, as it is certainly not meant to liberate them. Nonetheless, Weil uses the trope of return positively, even in the situation of violence and death. The imagery rests on the contrast between Wolf's land, Vlčí země, an evil German territory and its ill-natured soil, and the land across the border. The moment of crossing the border is essential. The main protagonist in one of these marches the main protagonist is on the point of dying. Yet, he raised, quote, his head for the first time to look around, but was immediately struck down with a rifle butt and knocked to the ground. At least he could gaze at the ground as the blood from his foot soaked into it. Let it take his blood. Let it take his life as well. In this land, he is no longer a nag. He is a man whom this land has nourished, to whom it had given both joy and sorrow. The main protagonist eventually dies clutching his fingers into the soil of his homeland. Let us notice at this point what Weil does not talk about in the color story. Class perspective that decorated the Soviet narrative is missing. Return to Bohemia is not a return to a place that pursues utopian goals, nor is the return to Bohemia worded in Jewish terms. There is no indication about what the prisoner's origin is. And we know that both Jews, but also Czechs, were dying. Thank you, I already read it backwards, were dying in death marches. However, 13 years after the colors, one of Weil's late works, Lamentation for the 77,000 Victims, the identity of those who return is clear. The concluding section of this text mourn Jews, explicitly Jews. Ashes cover the countryside, rise to the heavens, and millions perish in the ovens. Those 77,000 from my native land are only a drop in the ocean. And the shadows and the handful of those who survive can see shadows of unburied loved ones whose ashes have been mixed into the earth. The shadows are silent, as if reproachful or on guard. Yet their ashes have turned into fertile soil, the good earth from which crops grow and trees blossom. Walk through this land, and beauty will shine in the brightness of dawn, where waters rush in meadows, rush in meadows, and forests whisper in the mountains. The shadows walk with you hand in hand, for this is their land too, in peace and serenity. Reference on the Czech national anthem, leaving out. To be sure, the idea of return has been a major concept, and Weil construes his feeling not only by the way of high-style language, but also specific images, including those that highlight water, territorial integrity, fertile soul. Clearly, Weil moved beyond the concept of displacement, I'm leaving a little bit out, in explicitly granting the feeling of belonging to Jews at the end. Admittedly, this trajectory was long. As we have seen at the very end of the 1930s, in The Wooden Spoon, Jan Fischer acknowledges his displacement in Kyrgyzstan, but by deciding to return to his homeland. But he does not specify it as a Jewish displacement or Jewish return. This is quite in line with the style of his days. Obviously, after 1945, there is a major change. What is the value of this change? What is the experience of the Holocaust simply? Was it that the experience of the Holocaust simply untied Weil's tongue as a Jew? The answer is, I think, in the positive, as Weil works after 1945 repeatedly show. But this does not prevent us from stressing that in the Lamentation, he raised the return of shadows to their native land. This is a return of dead people. And this, I think, is a trope in other works of Czech literature that validates Jewish belonging to Bohemia by way of death. The final request is that this land be and continues to be a shared land, but those who return validate their right by simply being dead. Thank you. I had to cut it a little.